On July 2nd, 1776, it was approved by the Continental Congress for the United States of America to declare independence from Great Britain. And then 2 days later, on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was finalized and signed. And for the first 13 years of us being a nation, we operated under what are known as the Articles of Confederation. But in 1789, we adopted our current U.S. Constitution. And 2 years later, we added what is known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to that Constitution. Our Constitution is a powerful document. And today, the U.S. Constitution is the oldest active codified constitution in the entire world. And we are actually the longest lasting democracy at 232 years if you count from when our Constitution was first put into place. Our country and Constitution have survived where others have failed. But our Constitution is unique. And for us to continue to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Abraham Lincoln famously said, our founding fathers recognized that we, as Americans, must be people of virtue. In 1798, John Adams, our second president and co-author of the Declaration of Independence, he wrote this: "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." And then pay attention to this. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." So John Adams basically was saying that our Constitution and our government only work for people who are electing representatives, for those people who are voting to be moral and religious. Sam Adams, John Adams' second cousin, who I discovered did actually brew beer. They don't just post his name on there. He did do that, but his more noteworthy activities were that he was a statesman, he was a philosopher, and he was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He said this: "Neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt." And then Benjamin Franklin, also another founding father, inventor, diplomat, and writer, said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." And it would seem that many of the men, and there are many others that I did not mention, but many of these men who fought so hard to establish this great country of ours felt that it would stand or fall not because of our great economic power, not because of our military might, not because of our vast natural resources, and not because of our intellect or ingenuity. These men believed that the United States of America, as a republic, would only survive as a free nation governed by the people if the people themselves remain virtuous, and virtuous as dictated by morality and religion. In other words, it was their belief that our country could not survive as it was originally intended, with the values that are talked about in the Declaration of Independence, people being created equal, us having inalienable rights, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. If we, who have the power to elect leaders, no longer have the moral and religious intellect to elect leaders of outstanding moral and religious character, our downfall as a nation will naturally follow as we cease to be a people who are virtuous. And I believe that our founding fathers were wise in this assessment, because only a man or a woman of character is going to vote for somebody who will do the right thing rather than vote for the person who is going to most benefit themselves. Only a man or woman of character will seek to defend the rights of a person and the freedoms of a person who may disagree with them and even hate them, rather than seek to suppress their rights or censor them. And only a man or woman of character is going to vote for someone who will lead in the difficult and godly way rather than in the popular way. So on the day that we celebrate our independence, it is the perfect day to say that America needs men and women of virtue. It needs men and women of virtue to be the predominant influencers in our American society and culture. And America needs Christians to teach, mold, and mentor those influencers. That is, in fact, part of our role as Christians. Our mission as Christians is to love God, love people, and to make disciples. Making disciples is teaching, it is molding, it is mentoring people to follow Jesus. Jesus was, of course, the human embodiment of virtue. It was Jesus himself who said that only God is good. And if that is true, which I believe that is true, and if you believe that that is true, then nobody can truly be virtuous, truly be moral, and truly be good if they are not following the one true God who embodies all that is good. No leader, no politician, no influencer can truly lead in completeness the United States in virtue if they are not a committed follower of Jesus Christ. But we can only elect men and women of true virtue if there are enough voters to elect men and women of virtue. Few voters are going to vote for somebody, a leader or a politician or even follow an influencer who is a committed follower of Jesus Christ if they themselves are still enslaved to sin and the ruler of this world. They're still opposed to the kingdom of God after all. So why would they want more of God's kingdom here? So before we can elect and support men and women of virtue to be leaders and influencers in our society, we need citizens who are pursuing virtue for themselves. If the United States needs people of virtue, citizens of virtue, for it to continue as our founding fathers talked about how they intended, then the reality is this, and this is sort of interesting to think about, but what this means is that making disciples of other people, making disciples of your fellow citizen, is actually also an act of patriotism. It is the only way to ensure that this country will continue to exist as a free and noble country. And this is where you and I really start to come in. Not only as individuals, but also as a church, as a community here. You see, America needs you. New York State needs you. Ballston Spa and Milton need you. They need you. In 1 Peter 2:9, which Ron read earlier, Peter said this to Christians: "You are royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for he called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light." Now, I mentioned this when we actually did our full study through 1 Peter, that we should not confuse, as some people do, this verse it's saying that we are literal priests. We're not literal priests, just like we're not literal stones that Peter actually talks about just a few verses earlier. However, we do function like priests in that we are to be holy, we're to share with, and we're to lead the nations towards God. And Moses talks a little bit about this idea of sharing. He talks about this in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And he says this: "You must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them on your hands and wear them on your forehead as reminders. Write them on your doorposts of your house and on your gates. You and I are called to tell people about God. We're called to tell people about Jesus, to speak and to share about him without ambiguity and without shame. We're always to be teaching, always to be sharing about the good things that God has done, what he is going to do in the future, and the things that he calls us to do. We are to teach about virtue, not just to our fellow believers, but really for the benefit of everybody. We just finished going through our short course that I talked about, Becoming a Contagious Christian, which taught us how each of us is built differently to share our faith in our own unique way, a way that is most natural to each of us. We're to share as individuals, but as the course was kind of telling us, we're also to share as a body of Christians, as a whole church, as a congregation working together. And I'm excited to see how that is going to be continuing for us in the future as we put that into more and more practice. You see, people learn about virtue from us in two ways. One of those ways is in the things that we say and the things that we teach, just like we read in these couple passages. But the other way people learn about virtue is from the things that we do. Proverbs 31, verse 8 and 9 says this: "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and the helpless, and see that they get justice." And in James, we read this, James 1:27. "Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for the orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you." So we're called to actually care for people. We're actually called to put this virtue into practice. So people learn about virtue from what we say and what we do. We teach and we model what it is to be virtuous. And again, we're the only ones as Christians really who are able to do this in completeness, because again, only God is good. And we are called to make disciples, and making disciples is part of this teaching and molding and mentoring process. And really, this is a tremendous responsibility for us. It requires the best of us, and it requires discipline and commitment to this cause. So leading up to this sermon, I dug into our church history a little bit, and it made sense because we're talking about the history of our country today as a nation. And so what I found when I was doing this digging, I thought was actually pretty cool. And one of the things I love about history is that it so often inspires me to move beyond things that sometimes I've sort of set as limits, as limiting factors to my way of thinking or believing about things. And this brief look into our own history, that's exactly what it did for me. And I hope this short snapshot I'm going to give you this morning does the same for you. So many of you may be unaware of how long of a history this congregation actually has. We're a congregation that's actually been in Ballston Spa since 1917. So we're about 104 years old as a congregation. Not the oldest church in the village by any means, but definitely a part of the history of this community. We are planted by Mr. and Mrs. Fowler, who came from a Christian Missionary Alliance church out of Newark, New Jersey. They weren't formal church planters by any means. This wasn't a formal church plant, and it wasn't even done by somebody who was a professional pastor. It just was two faithful Christians who sought to be obedient to God's call and to plant a church here, to be able to share the gospel in their new community. And the Fowlers actually enlisted the help of a man by the name of Frank Squires. He was a Reverend Frank Squires. He was actually the pastor of the Alliance Church in Schenectady, and he became our first pastor here as well. Now, prior to 1957, Ballston Spa, I learned, was apparently a very divided village in a lot of different ways. With the wealth, most of the wealth and the business professionals, they all lived on the south end of the village. And if you've gone and you've walked around in the south end, that's where Front Street is, that's the library. I mean, it's beautiful buildings. big business buildings. The houses are immaculate out there. Just a lot of money was clearly in that area at one point in time. The south end, or the north end, on the other hand, was where all the immigrants came in, such as the Irish, the Italians, and generally all of the working class families lived on the northern end of the village. And you don't see, if you look around, as many of the grand types of homes on our side of the village, or even very fancy businesses. The only real sort of fancy building, if you will, is the factory. But the factory, that's what it was. It was actually a cotton mill when it first opened. So all of the buildings on this side were much more geared to the immigrants and the working class families. Now, I don't know how much of this was planned, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if this was intentional based on the values of the Christian Missionary Alliance. But our church was planted right in the middle of where these immigrants and working class families all lived. In the beginning, we were actually called the Ballston Gospel Mission. That was our name. We were a mission, which I think is pretty cool, the Ballston Gospel Mission. We rented a building that no longer exists, and we rented apparently a little spot right in here. This is an old, before this picture, this is actually an old glove manufacturing plant that existed. So we rented a little room up here, and that's kind of where we did our thing. Building no longer exists today. I believe that is the site of the current Union gas station, so kind of right at that Y by the Dunkin' Donuts and the Aldi. So I think that's where that building used to be. But we weren't in that building for very long. Actually, on June 21st, 1918, we were formally incorporated into the Christian Missionary Alliance, so we became part of the alliance very early on. And sometime that year, so just a year after we started, we moved into our own building on 64th South Street, which is actually near the old elementary school. So this is an old picture of what it looked like from an old newspaper clipping. Now, I don't know why this is, but it seems to still be true today. We seem to like to change our name a lot as a church. Originally we were the Ballston Gospel Mission, then we became the Gospel Chapel, and in this picture, actually we're called the Gospel Tabernacle before we settled on various versions of Ballston Spa Alliance, something like that, and then more recently, Community Alliance Church. So this building does still exist today, and actually that is, as far as I can tell, the current building. I think it's an apartment building now. It's still 64th South Street, so I'm assuming it's the same building. It looks like it. And from another picture here, you can see how it's right by the old elementary school. So it's kind of cool that piece of our history is still standing there today. And then we have the building that we're in today, which was actually built in the late 1969. And after that, we actually sold our property on 64 South Street. So basically, we haven't moved much. We're still kind of in the same general area. And this congregation, again, has been part of the community. Community Alliance Church has been part of the history and the light into this community for over 100 years. And in that time, this congregation has a very rich history of teaching and service into the community. Part of that making disciples, part of that teaching virtue to this region. I was able to find some newspaper clippings from the late 1970s that showed a ton of this kind of stuff going on. I'm sure there was other stuff, but we didn't have the history recorded, basically. But I know at least from the mid-70s into the 80s, this place was really hopping. There was a lot of stuff going on here. The average regular attendance was around 175 people, and we were extremely outreach-oriented. And I know that there are actually some of you who are attending here still today who were brought to faith during that period of time under the leadership at that time and what this church was doing. And there's so many people I know who have at some point in time come through these church doors and who are still part of the community, still Christians today. Just to give you some examples of what we were involved with back then, we were serving breakfasts to the Navy on a weekly basis. We had a preschool in this building that served the community, was making disciples of children from a young age. Parents brought their kids here to be cared for. We hosted, you may be familiar with the name, a much younger Crawford Loritz, he's a much older evangelist today, but it's a picture of him from the 70s. We kind of hosted him coming through, evangelizing to the community. And we also played a real significant role in helping Vietnam refugees relocate in the United States in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. This whole church was very much involved in that stuff. And you might actually recognize the young lady from that picture there, right there. Very own Kay Ether, who went to be with the Lord on December of this last year. So this is her in the newspaper, and her whole family brought in some refugees from Vietnam to just kind of help get them into the United States and settled in the country. So some pretty awesome stuff that we were involved with here as a church. Now, I'm not going to get into all of this stuff today, but it is very evident to me that there was such extremely powerful work going on here from 1917 into the late 80s and into the early 90s that we were a real threat in the spiritual realms as a church. And Satan sought to take this church out, to wipe it out, basically. And he did succeed in causing some real damage to this congregation simply by fracturing the unity that existed at that time here. And I don't know a lot of the details. I don't know all of what went on, but it doesn't seem like there was a scandal or anything at this church, anything of that sort that was going on. But it seems like this congregation in the early 90s was fractured because divisiveness and discord was sown here and was basically able to take a stranglehold in this congregation. And for years, this church has struggled to recover the unity that was lost at that time. But what I think is exciting, that excited both myself and my wife as we were coming here and as I was coming here to become the pastor here, is that the outreach, the vision, and the passion that was established way back in 1917 when we were a gospel mission, that vision and that passion have really been coming back to life. And the steps that Pine Knolls has made, the steps that Pastor Gary made, and I'm sure others before them, as they've been working to reignite that fire of outreach and care for this community. And I think it's really awesome that today we're not just a church that is living on the memories of our past. Sure, we got some awesome stuff that happened in our past, but that's just not what we're all about today. We're not just living on what we once did and telling stories about that stuff. Community Alliance Church, by the grace and leadership of God, is continuing to have a real and growing impact in our community. And just to give a few examples, we have Kids Club. Kids Club, the Diaz family and the Satechny family, both are involved in reaching out to kids and blessing them and the families as well in both Saratoga West Mobile Home Park and Saratoga Village Mobile Home Park. And they've been doing this for a number of years, teaching them the gospel, providing for them, feeding them, giving them much needed things that these families need. A couple weeks ago, you learned how Eric and Katie are also doing additional outreach efforts with the meal ministry. Ministry that I'm hoping is going to be multiplied in a more organic way throughout the congregation. In all of our neighborhoods, your neighborhoods, as you are seeking to reach your own neighbors for Jesus Christ. And hopefully there'll be more families here that want to partner with these host families in doing that. So again, as a church, we're all kind of working together to advance the gospel. My wife and Katie are ministering to new moms in our region through the Ballston Spa Moms Group. New moms that have undergone a major transition in their lives. Many of them are not working just because a new child and are looking for new communities, new support, new relationships. And this ministry seeks to try and meet those needs. And it is a growing ministry. And we're in prayer that there's going to be even more explosive growth in this ministry over the next year or so. Cindy here is involved with Sisterhood Saturday, designed to bless women and offer women a way of coming in these doors may be a more natural way of introducing them to Jesus that's more comfortable to them. Children's ministry here did an Easter egg hunt this last Easter at a time when things were still in many ways closed up from the pandemic, and families were looking for much needed ways of getting together, having a little bit of fun, and that was something that we were able to provide and, again, reach out to our neighbors in our community. And then there are also many support ministries, such as the administrative board, who are here to provide much of the necessary infrastructure and materials so that all of these other types of things can happen. And finally, I'll just add that we as a church are even looking beyond all of this stuff to have a much more significant impact in the events that our community finds so important. We want to continue to be able to go to them and participate in the things that they value. Christmas events, summer events, the farmers market, the car show, just to name a few. We want to be able to love this community, to care for them, and invite them to come to know Jesus with no strings attached by us. So God has been and is continuing to prepare this church for the next step. And he's blessing it, and he's providing the resources that are so much needed for us to be able to take those next steps. And I don't even know how or why a lot of this stuff is even happening, how the materials and the finances are coming in, but I do know that God is providing in some really amazing ways. Before I got here, God, for example, he provided thousands of dollars for the massive redecoration and refurbishment to happen for the whole downstairs, so that now, at the time, there wasn't as many kids, but now there's tons of kids. It's a much needed area, and God sought to put everything in place and provide the resources so that we can have that downstairs area to use for that purpose. Last year, we received multiple sizable financial donations, one which was about $5,000 through the gift of a car. And through God's grace, in the past several months, we've been literally gifted thousands of dollars worth of materials and the equipment of use of equipment for clearing brush out in the back and for fencing for the children's play area that we're putting up outside. Again, stuff that is very much needed. The resources for concrete pad for the shed, and even for our new worship computer. All this stuff has been gifted to this congregation in one form or another, and it is by God's grace that this kind of stuff is happening. For the last 2 years, very exciting example, the district, so those guys that came here just a couple weeks ago, Dave Lynn shared as our district superintendent, seeing the need here and the vision here, how God is working in this congregation. The district has invested, over the past 2 years, $40,000 worth of finances so that we can continue in God's work at this church. And by God's grace, they just granted us another $25,000 for 2022. So again, amazing things that are going on here, and stuff that really is very much needed in this ministry because we're still kind of a small church. We have limited means on our own, but God is providing, which has just been amazing to see. And then beyond the finances, all of you are stepping up to serve. The amount of volunteer effort and additional volunteer effort has been amazing as you guys are seeking to fill so many needs that we have in all of our quickly growing ministries. And again, my wife and I are totally blown away with how God has been working and how God is preparing this church for the next steps ahead. But with all of that excitement, all of that celebration, all those amazing things, there is still a warning to kind of go along with all of this stuff. This church really rocked the spiritual realms in the past. It really did, and it has worked against Satan's agenda in this region. And Satan does not want to see this congregation reemerge in force in this area. He wants to take out me and my family. He wants to take out the leadership here. He wants to tempt us with pride, sexual sin, hatred. He wants Christians here to be self-centered and apathetic. That's what he wants. And he wants to sow discord and disunity in this church. Discord and disunity were the tactics that he used 20 years ago with a tremendous amount of success in nearly taking this church down. It seems that he has continued to use that same thing with some success since then. So we need to be on guard and be very careful, to be in prayer, to lean on and look to God as individuals and as a congregation. But we need to be ready to answer God's call. For the big things and for the small things, we need to love each other, to serve each other, and do these in genuine, true ways. Love the newcomers that are already and are continuing to come in our doors, and also to make disciples. We need to make disciples through teaching and modeling the ways of Jesus, not only to people in here, but again to our whole community, because these are the ways of virtue. These are the things that, again, America needs. America needs you. New York State needs you. Ballston Spa and Milton need you, and they all need all of us as a congregation. This is God's church. It is his bride, and as long as we look to Jesus, the gates of hell will not prevail. Let's pray.